Hello everyone, today we talk about Catharism and the beginning of its repression. We made a video a long time ago and I don't think we came back on the topic. We talked a lot about the integration of the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements, the Pataria for example, the Valdensians, etc. So we have seen a bit Arnold from Brescia, all these figures that really fit beautifully in many ways to this 12th century context of ecclesiology and of this actually a traumatic moment in which the Christianity was being torn apart, right? And this is actually a very serious topic. I haven't checked how this is dealt with in for example, on YouTube. That can be an indicator how popular culture has received the thing. I suspect that there is always mainly the interest into the, in the morbid aspects of the Cathar repressions. That's not important. Speaking about the massacres, some haven't even spoken about genocides. For medieval times, speaking of genocide should be done always very cautiously, and we have and we will keep observing how naturally the context of this reality is particularly important to clearly define at least what can be the traceable historical boundaries of an essence of this phenomena. It's not easy to do. First of all, because Cathar history has been told mostly from the side of those who survived, simply because the Cathars were wiped out. Right? It's not that history is, as you know, I hate the phrase, which I find to be dramatically idiotic, that history is written by the winners, which is, by the slightest, not true, actually. If one looks at the history of historiography, history is written by historians, and naturally, by the 12th century, we have a few sources, generally speaking, that are naturally very politically oriented, ideologically oriented in many ways, as any other source at the time. Had we had Cathar sources, they would have been exactly the same, right? So the criticism, even here, thinking the Cathars were, the free thinkers of medieval era were brutally repressed by the obscurantistic church and so on, is one of those keys of interpretations that we can't, fortunately, even speak anymore in universities, because it's also an extremely superficial and narrow-minded approach to not just to the topic but to history in the first place, and on the base of actual historical evidence, not just in moods of people, what they believe or what they don't believe, right? And there is a lot about Catharism that has suscitated fascination, primarily in fact that they are kind of mysterious figures. We don't know extremely much about the Cathars, their organization, what they actually were, right? As far as I know, I'm not an expert on the topic, but as far as I understood, now there is a historiographical consensus that tends to stress at least the fact that together with the Cathars were grouped lots of other people that probably didn't have anything to do with that, not just in the massacres, but properly in the political and social intentions of a broader movement that went beyond Catharism and had to do, aside from the spiritual bounds, also with very concrete political reasons. As always, look at the policy of the County of Toulouse, the one with the county with the expansionism of the French monarchy, the relations of southern Occitania with for example, the Kingdom of Aragon. What the Albigensian Crusade was actually about politically, right? Not religiously speaking, because you would find actually a few of that. And mostly from sources that, of course, had to, were puzzled by this new form of violence was reversed now from after, the beginning of Crusades, now for the first time in an inwards direction, so within the same Christianity. And this was felt as an incredibly unsettling and disturbing thing already at the time. It was a deep spiritual sensibility within medieval Christianity that eludes in this regard the side of the story, because you could say, the official sources didn't even want to know what the actual massacres were, but no, we actually know that, and this proves, by the way, that the Middle Ages were a dramatically open society, dramatically intelligent, let's say, sincere society. We can't say honest in the most intellectual sense of the word, because as we were saying before, it wasn't anything like we can think of free thinking. But it was a world that could be shocked by certain events, but at the same time pointing them out that this is a prerogative of the West in many ways. Right? I was reflecting just today on the impact just on these events could have on, for example, Western European historiography, and how much less we know about Bogomilianism and the Paulicians for example, in the Balkans, also in the Near East, and how, broadly speaking, the Western civilization was already able to look within itself and being critical and being, objective, at least by certain standards that were unknown in other areas of the world. And this is extremely important to stress. Like, this is a wholly different topic that eludes today's one that will remain fundamentally within the boundaries of ecclesiology, right, history of religions, and ecclesiastical policy, etc. The clash against Catharism was dramatically important, as we will see, for defining properly the prerogatives, the authority of the Catholic Church, actually in a positive sense. Right. Today, I wouldn't want to make the usual point that of orthodoxy crushing the extremistic fringes, but there's surely something about it that is naturally very difficult to frame exactly in these terms, in the broad, if anything, for the enormous scale that this phenomenon had. Right. Because as we were saying before, it wasn't just a religious problem; it was just a part of Europe that was trying to essentially detach from another in terms of ecclesiastical policy and also of mere politics, right, under the pressure of many other influences that weren't religious at all, but were mainly political in the first place. And it's obvious that within politics there is everything. So even we have this modernistic stigma on everything religious that is this unfortunate legacy that we bring back to the radical aspects of enlightenment that needed to point at the church, saying that was a negative influence throughout all the history of mankind, history of Christian Europe, as if during medieval times these institutions weren't, for example, researched by everybody, by all the subjects, by all the believers, including the heretics, right? The heretics weren't thinking as also certain ecclesiology, extremistic ecclesiology, which also exists, wanted to see as depraved monsters and kind of subverted. Actually, the same heretics largely, if you look at the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements, even in the most radical instances, looked at Rome and the papacy as the natural and obvious and exactly the very center of Christianity that had to be reformed, that had to take, let's say, a guidance from. Right, the myth that these were, hippies that just wanted to go out there and being free and open and tolerant. These people were radically violent, intolerant, absolutely uncompromising in many ways, as much as the elites were. So we have to contextualize this, because if you start telling a story as it's usually done, like either you're pro-clerical or an anti-clerical or an atheist or a believer, that's not going to help very much, right? Nobody cares what people believe. People should care about what history is about and what the bases are for this, and then you can believe in something, which is also an extremely difficult thing to do. That poses enormous conscientious problem that, incidentally, at the time were felt way more than today. Today, with even people or let's say atheistic or anti-theistic people, on average, reason in terms that unfortunately have nothing to do with theism or atheism anymore. They're just following certain modernistic ideologies that, even if they cannot accept that, and this happens at many levels of society. And I personally don't think that whether you are religious or you're not religious is the problem, but actually what you add to that in terms of simple ignorance and evil, in terms of talking about things that you ultimately don't even make an effort to understand, right? So I make the medieval Christianity playlist on Schwerpunkt is pretty hefty, and we have discussed, and we'll keep discussing a lot these issues. But this is the general message that I always try to give, right? That I'm not doing a pleasure to anyone. I'm just to try to stop a moment and say, okay, I believe this and that, but I give you kind of the idea of why I think this, and I still present you the I can't say mainstream, because mainstream doesn't exist, right? There's nothing mainstream, for example, in historiography, right? Everybody has his or her own ideas, but let's say what there is the overwhelming consensus about historiography, and that's not easy either, right? Because even opinions in that regard, from a strictly historical, not ideological point of view, can be controversial. So what's the deal with the Cathars in general, right? Why did this movement begin to create actually an enormous problem, right? I found some articles on the internet today when I was choosing the topics of the pictures that I had to insert in here, and obviously I didn't read them because I don't give a damn about it. I prepare this stuff on books that I have on my own, but unavoidably, when you click on the picture, you have the title of these articles, and there were lots of questions like, how important were actually not just the Cathars, but the radical movements? What kind of threat did they pose to the establishment at the time? The answer is a freaking big one. Actually, a freaking enormous one. The 12th century could have easily produced a break, a schism, or even worse, actually, within Christianity. It's not just a matter of papal policy that naturally at the time had become dominant after the Gregorian reforms, but the papacy woke up from the Gregorian reforms, victorious from the struggle, and had to cope with this dramatic situation for which Europe was growing like crazy for pre-industrial standards, and this system was uncontrollable, right? Of course, the Roman Church didn't have a complete, not even far from having a complete control on Western Christendom. It had its own nets that that were able to, that granted them an influence on the elites, the lay and the secular ones alike. The power of the Roman Church was built all over about this negotiation, like any single other power of the time, simply because they didn't have any, right? There wasn't anything like a centralized control. There was no way even a medieval sovereign could even dream of having like that, especially on a continental scale. And this was a turbulent period. The same papacy and the lay sovereigns of Europe were in fierce competition ones with the other. The struggle for investitures was settled, at least for what the respective competences of the papacy and of the emperor in Italy and Germany respectively had to be. But this is the century of Frederick I Barbarossa, of the great wars of the Lombard League, was backed by the papacy. It was a devastating moment. The same Barbarossa actually, depending on the current political situation, would either support or actually repress the heretics in an anti-Roman fashion. So the situation was dramatic. We've seen it especially in the video with Arnold from Repression and the Valdensians, right? Because these movements were popping out everywhere, and especially in the most advanced areas of Europe. Italy, France, Germany, right? So they were extremely dangerous because they weren't spreading among the peasantry. Actually, the church didn't give a damn practically about whatever the peasantry thought, simply because they didn't have the material or moral means to present any kind of competitor towards the elites. The problem here was when some of the richest sections of the populations, like merchants especially, think about Occitan, where the Cathars would spread from some of the richest areas in Europe. They were capable of countering in many ways even the local elites, or maybe they were the same local elites who tried to escape from broader plans of universalism, as we were saying before, the plan of the French kings to reassert their authority all over the kingdom's territory, and also and consequently in alliance with the papacy to extend the Roman Catholic ecclesiastical administration in these territories. So, and these phenomena were also not to be blamed in a strict sense of saying, oh, look at these guys want to impose things on our people. right? Because there were people, that were actually fine with that. Like half of the people were fine with that, the other half had to lose instead from it, and it was just like a conflict, like that once exist constantly all over society, and it wasn't about a matter of being the good guy or the evil guy, right? And it's also interesting how medieval propaganda was extremely sophisticated and way more intelligent than most of today's brains actually are, easily, and put the thing in bitterly ideological terms, because that was the normality, right? What do you say to a political opponent? This is actually the moment in which the thing was taking place. Of course, if you oppose the papacy, you're an heretic, and you should be fought as such. And what do you think it's done? Because the person is evil? No, because the person needs that power, just like the other does, and the others were doing exactly the same. There was even a kind of a standard set of insults that, even in popular culture have become like, if a guy was accused of sodomy, now we think, because he was an homosexual. That have nothing to do with that. Or if he was an Epicurean, because, as if he was reading Epicurus all the day long, and then, he was an heretic. Those people were perfect Christians most of the time. There weren't any, there wasn't any room for thinking outside Christianity in this realm, and that wasn't even enforced. This is what it's very difficult for a modern mind to understand. It's not that there was, a guy next to every door to spy what you were doing and burning you at the stake if you didn't obey to the thing. Because most people were absolutely comforted and were actually searching, especially in this very period, as the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements show, an ever closer connection. They were talking about exactly the simpler people, right? So we had those they had to lose from all the system, more than the others, to exactly renovate the connection with the Bible and Christianity. That was unavoidable. That's all what the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements are called after for, right? It doesn't take much to understand. But also, the simple idea of controlling anyone was unattainable, as we've seen. Right, it was no other mean. The problems began to raise exactly as we were saying, where the elites, where the hierarchies began to say things that eventually weren't completely fitting with more than even just the religious, but the political agendas of the greater powers. If one doesn't set this frame, there is no way you can historically speak of these things. Like the rest is just ideological trash, right? If you want to have a serious discourse based on the latest, most sophisticated historiographical acquisitions, you can't think outside of these boundaries, right? Because that's not history. That's not historical reality as we know it. It's just a personal opinion based on whatever you love or hate Christianity, and nothing else, right? And that's what we escape from as much as we can in Schwerpunkt, right? That once again, there is absolutely nothing wrong if you believe or if you don't believe. I don't care. But when we talk about history, that's extremely important, because of course we are all biased, but at the same time we should make an effort to be as objective as we can. We don't have to be mental eunuchs that raise to the ground every kind of belief or sympathy, but we have to be honest about it and not thinking that our mental fantasies are actually what people study for a lifetime and pretending them what they should think or not. And this tells you how far the popular average is completely detached from higher education in the West. It's always been so. Even here it's normal in many ways, but it's always the same thing. If you don't know something, don't say that, or at least try to read something more and expand the thought, because once it's automatic. Once you learn that, you start reasoning like that. So it's not that you're imposed or anything, right? So differently from, for example, the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements that proposed essentially just a reform that could heal what was perceived as the degeneration of the entire ecclesiastical world, but something that didn't intend in this matter to place themselves outside of the church, right? The Cathars built gradually a separate body, right? This is the main problem with the thing ever, right? It's not that Cathar instances were necessarily whatever they were, right? Because we don't precisely know, at least in most of the cases. This is the main problem. It was the idea of a split of Western Christendom. Right? You can imagine the consequences of, because this is not just the Pope losing something. This is the possibility of creating an overruling political and moral, balance on that reality. I find it disgusting, but the history of the medieval church is treated as if these guys were just piling up money and doing nothing. If you look at what they actually did in terms just of pacification, that's something never brought up. According to you, what did happen when two Christian powers began to fight against each other? Normally speaking, within Christendom, the papacy immediately intervened. It says, "What the frick are you doing here? Right? Calm down, slow down." Of course, this had political interests behind, but generally speaking, it was a positive matter, right? Because nobody liked conflict. People were fed up with wars, right? This was the 12th century is a terrible century, right? In many ways, in the centuries we attribute usually the Renaissance to, like the 12th or the 16th century, were some of the most traumatic centuries in the history of mankind. It's some of the most radically violent, obscure, traumatic, upsetting moments in history. The 16th century, you think about the Renaissance, the 12th century, again, the Renaissance, these were constantly tormented by wars, as it had never been seen before, exactly because of this boost that had been given, right? Because there were many more resources to burn, right? We made that video about the Brabançon, for example, in France, right? It was devastating times. And this is where the elites begin to see that this thing cannot work like that, right? As long as there is an improvement, and there is a new energies that are unrestrained, you have to give them boundaries. You have to say, okay, I will bring an order to this, because it can't go on like that. If you think about it, the history of the world has always been like that, right? There's been a moment of chaos where someone arrived and said, okay, now stop, right? Now, that what people did with this chaos, it's questionable sometimes, but generally speaking, we cannot avoid to recognize that throughout all the Middle Ages, the elites worked constantly to give a stabilization to the system. That is, most immediately, that wars stopped, right? At least to be fought in an uncontrolled way from the higher institutions, so that it's not the first guy could come up and say, okay, let's destroy that city, or kill these people, or rob their possessions and fuck authority, right? Because most of these movements were fundamentally about that. Right, and the interesting thing is that the civilization, the Orthodoxy prevailed in that regard, exactly because the majority of the people that were the ones that were suffering of this, having their families killed, having to pay, having their houses destroyed, their harvest devastated, were saying, what the hell, right? I prefer to give more authority to this guy that is placed there for that sake at least, than for these other random people doing all this mess, right? This is in many ways, there's something positive about it, right? Historically speaking, it's a pattern you can find many occasions, right? After all, we were able, as human societies, to give us a stabilization over time. This is a trend that can be easily seen, right? You can't say, okay, well, things could always go downhill, and sometimes they went, but if you really look at what humans tendentially tried to do, it was for stabilization of one another, right? Leave aside the moral aspect of the story, but it's undeniable that we went through a general improvement in terms of history of civilization. So, besides a doctrinal frame that was well distinguished from the Roman Christian one, the Cathars gave to themselves also a proper hierarchy. There is no other way in a stateless society for a state to emerge. And this is the history of the Middle Ages in a nutshell, right? People entrust that power for social and political benefit of the collectivity. This is how medieval civilization evolved. Right? Look at the history. We make it in Schwerpunkt. Sometimes even we attempt this long-term perspectives to be observed. And that's objectively what happened. Look at what was Europe in the 6th century. Look at what was by the 15th, the beginning of 16th. There's no comparison, right? So, was winning there. Was the ancien regime being established? And did that stop improvement? No. Europe kept growing and growing, right? And think when the way they did. So it's undeniable in many ways. So besides a doctrinal frame was well distinguished from the Christian Roman one, the Cathars gave themselves also a proper own hierarchy, their own sacerdotal body, right? Their own organization that would have elevated their movement to the role of an alternative church compared to the Catholic one, right? So this is very important. It's not important to say, okay, now what do you think it's right or wrong? But just think about the event, epocally speaking, and from a political point of view. Just think about the impact, the conflict that this triggered in the first place, right? And also, anyway, this was a relatively slow process, right? So much that some historians arrived even to deny the precise identity of Catharism, right? In this broader climate of religious ferments that characterized Europe at the beginning of the 12th century, right? Something that exceeded, went far beyond Western Europe. This is something that was happening in the Byzantine world, in the Muslim world alike, right? These civilizations were growing in many ways at the time in parallel, right? And such interpretation, I mean, the idea that it wasn't, after all, like an homogeneous Cathar reality, at least from the one that eventually the Roman sources depicted it, so much that the Cathar could be just an accusation, but also maybe not exactly corresponding, not just to something concrete from an ecclesiological point of view, but in fact not even in an alternative or positional sense to the one of Rome, is an interesting hypothesis we should recollect during the video. But the Cathars, right, are supposedly to be identified in this alleged, by the way, continuity of the doctrine of the pures. In fact, the Cathars, from katharos in Greek, means pure, with that goes along with the tradition of the Manichaean gnosis, right, against which the fathers of the church had already fought in the first centuries of Christianity, and that, according to some scholars, would have essentially survived in the, let's say, Byzantine philosophical and religious melting pot, right, to be eventually welcomed by certain movements of religious dissidents that also in the East, in fact, were moving on the pattern of this, let's say, evangelical rediscovery. Think about all the things implied here. First of all, the idea of the survival of certain ideologies is indeed true, right? If you look in the Byzantine world, in the Muslim world, there has always been something comparable to what was happening in the Western world, like an Orthodoxy, right? And then an heterodoxy that stood aside in a marginal sense. Think about the Shia compared to the great Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, or in spite of the moment in which actually the Abbasid Caliphate was about to become Shia, or the Bogomils in the Balkanic hinterland is notoriously a nightmare, historically speaking, compared to the coastal Constantinopolitan Byzantine authority, we could say. In Europe, maybe not so much. The thing was different, but also because there were different social classes. The Byzantine Empire and Islam didn't have the same, for example, economical dynamism, pre-capitalistic dynamism that the Western Europe was starting having at the time. So that's also a matter of literally knowing how to read, right? Which is what the only way you can, in many ways, interpret the Bible, right? Because of course many people learned by heart just to the oral tradition. But also let's think that we said before, everybody was Christian. There's no doubt about that, actually. What we often forget is that you can be Christian and pagan at the same identical time, right? There were lots of beliefs at the time were shared even by the same ecclesiastical hierarchies, by everybody. Think about astrology. Think about, these were things that, as long as they weren't put openly in, in opposition to orthodoxy, to the doctrine, were actually fine. The world was full of this ideas and beliefs, and how, as we were saying before, how could you even think to get rid of them, and especially why? Right? They were part of that culture. That's what medieval Europe was about. So regarding the Eastern contact, a lot has been written about it. Today we can't stop excessively on it, but it's been usually believed that the penetration in Europe of dualist doctrines, Manichaean type, considered by some scholars as a sort, in fact, of neo-Manichaean revival, right? By others, instead, like a sort of implicit, an exasperation of the implicit opposition between God and Mammon, so the material wealth, basically, that the Gospels didn't conceal, and that had been an important deal, would remain in many ways. Thinking about even the Protestant Reformation, Luther started in many ways from those same bases. After all, St. Paul, St. Augustine had been very close to those ideas. I had stressed, certain precise boundaries in that regard, but they were very borderline, especially think about St. Augustine. This Manichaean ideals went all in parallel with Neoplatonism in many ways. It's not a surprise that by the 13th century, Orthodoxy in the West was reaffirmed dramatically thanks to scholasticism, based in turn on Aristotelianism, that is naturally the triumph of reason and science, and and not of the emotionalistic, let's say, ascetic traditions of Platonism, that the church from that moment onwards never looked upon very favorably on, right? The church as a system, historically speaking, in the Middle Ages, in modern age, went actually to repress most of the, emotionalistic, superstitious, there were referential books you have to look at and to be reasonable about. And this is in many ways what the Byzantine Orthodoxy also was against the Bogomils. This is what the Sunni Orthodoxy was against certain other extremistic sects at the outskirts of the Caliphate. So this is very important to stress in a political perspective, right? That the idea that such ideas emerge where there is something else that doesn't work in terms of control from the side of, we could say, the state that is being born in, not in a modernistic sense, but properly, the idea of a state as a major structure that is ruled, in a systematic, orderly, and in fact financed and agreed way in many ways. So it's obvious that by the 12th century, all this enormous wealth that Europeans and other countries were collecting, treasuring because of the revived intercontinental trade and all this stuff, was presenting, in a world was still dramatically poor, of course, by our own standards, the possibility of enriching oneself in ways that even culturally had never been conceived before, since centuries, right? So there was an evident contrast between some of the wealthiest merchants and these swarms of beggars that were the norm in any medieval city, for example. The city, the center of these heresies were in the countryside, like in the Balkans, for example. These heresies were in Western Europe, were centered in the cities, as we were saying before, among people who could read, who had money, who were even powerful, right? And think about the connections even with the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements. It's the same exact things. Saint Francis of Assisi was, son of a rich merchant, went to war, that had a knightly lifestyle, was a fighter, was an extremely earthly person in many ways. And what he does in his choice is to reject material wealth. And that's where we have the second most religious figure in the history of the medieval Christendom after Saint Benedict. So the experiences from which these movements, such as Catharism, emerged from, were very common to after all, to the same Christian orthodoxy in some ways. And this is what eventually facilitated even its incorporation. Like the Franciscans were quite borderline, were quite heterodox. The same St. Francis actually, said certain things that are extremely, controversial in Orthodox terms, right? Eventually were normalized, but he took, to take away the extremistic fringe from the Franciscans to be assimilated, to essentially transform them into a copy of the Dominicans instead, that went by the book, and were created, incidentally, exactly to counter Catharism in from Spain to Occitania. And this is the background. For what concerns always the Eastern connection, we observe objectively that the same years in which Catharism was taking form, the Bulgarian Bogomils were struggling against the repression by the side of the Emperor Michael Comnenus in 1143, right? The Byzantines went very harshly with these guys, right? As you know, the Byzantine world is unknown to the concept of crusade. When they looked at these Westerners that were coming, these massive armies under their walls, ruled by, sent there by a bishop. The hell, like in the Byzantine Empire, the emperor is at the head of the church. He decides, not the church, right? It's not that, especially the Constantinopolitan archbishop didn't have anything to say overall, but eventually the empire, the secular power won in this regard. But if there is a moment in which the Byzantines, went with iron fist in a extremely direct connection, ideological connection between the defense of orthodoxy and the repression, the armed repression, by the way, of an simply infidel sect, like in this case, this case of the Bogomils, right? The struggle against the Bogomils was dramatic because, as I was saying before, it was spreading in Bulgaria, right? An area that had been actually crushed by the Byzantines, as you know, since the previous century, bringing the end of the First Bulgarian Empire, but that remained in many ways inaccessible, right? These were, difficult territories to control for an empire, as we were seeing, were mostly centered on the coastal cities of the Aegean. And in this Balkanic hinterland, the situation was extremely different. The repression was extremely different. It was an era of guerrilla, of scorched earth strategies, of extremely violent, by the way, measures that brought apparently, in fact, many Bogomils to take refuge in Western Europe. So Bogomilism, that is in this regard an originally peasant movement, right? It was there, like, declined in the Balkans according to the local political and social reality. There weren't cities as can mean them in the west of this area. There were important centers, towns, etc. But mostly this was it had taken kind of an identitary, I can't say even national, character, but it was evidently connected, in part at least, to even the resistance against the empire, broadly meant, with this very different potential between the two, let's say, this great divide between the two systems. In fact, the evangelical praxis of Bogomilism wasn't even trying to hide these pretty open spirit of revolt towards both the political and religious institutions of the Orthodox Church. And in fact, even in there, it had transformed gradually into a cult provided with its own doctrinal and dogmatic basis, right? That it's, as it's been noted historically, the radicalism aspect of Bogomilism was probably considered the devil, as a divinity was in itself eternal, right, at the same level of God. And this, as you know, what's the point here? That the dichotomy between, of course, God as pure spirit and the devil as pure matter. So this typical Neoplatonic Manichaean ideals, for which that come also from Iranian dualism, this idea of the eternal struggle between good and evil, and the fact that all the corporal, the bodily dimension is pure evil, right? So the main deal is that these Christians actually denied the dogma of incarnation, because they said that they denied Jesus had incarnated, They denied the cross as a symbol of Christianity because it was naturally made of matter. So you can't imagine the, the absolute irreconcilability of these ideals with anything was orthodox at the time. These were naturally the most radical fringes, but the concept at the base, even in the more moderate ones, was very borderline, very ambiguous in many ways. And there are traces all over, we can say, all over Christian history of this tendency, right? It's more like it's probably not even necessarily a historical continuity between the Manichaean sects, groups, or wherever you want to call them, but probably a specific take on the world, on what it is, right, that you can't find in any other society, right, even without the specific religious or cultural influences. But there is to be given to the Bogomils that, especially the ones of the first generations, that were extremely ardent to live according to the Apostolic example, right? And this remains the deep substance, the profound substance of the sect in itself, right? That they had objectively a very strict, a very true, a very idealistic in many ways, because this is a very idealistic movement that gathered people on the base of their true commitment, their true idea of in fact of challenging the material world, challenging this specific world that is meant as a product of the devil in many ways, because it's, as long as it's material, right? And it would have been exactly this profound Christian substance, after all, that was common to the religious ferments present also in the rest of Europe to provide to the Bogomil missionaries actually very good grafting terrain, let's say, for the spread of their doctrine in the West, right? It's possible to even trace their spread in the West after the measures that were taken by the Komnenian dynasty in Bosnia also, where they operated under the clothes of merchants, right? That's where they gathered. Bosnia was another region, incidentally, that was in between at that point, mostly has been contended between the Byzantine Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, right? It would always remain, a thorn in the side, not to say worse, for the Hungarian kings, because the area is very difficultly accessible. These communities spread even in there against that bigger, kingdom. Was actually an empire. The Hungarian wanted to integrate these lands, were also strategically, as you can imagine, very, very important for the control of the passes and so on. And these were disguised as merchants, and they from Central Europe they reached eventually Germany around the 40s of the 12th century, right? And this diaspora is well framed within the new context of contacts and exchanges, also cultural ones, between the West and the East, right? That were fueled at the time by the Crusade. Think about the importance of the Danubian route, that point for trade, commerce, for strategic, in fact, for the march towards the Black Sea, and from there to Constantinople, and so on. These are the years of the Second Crusade specifically. And that was the same route from which, for example, the German Crusaders arrived to Constantinople. So, let's say, in the second half of the 12th century, also in France, certain itinerant groups characterized by the adherence to the apostolical method, the contempt of the earthly goods, and the refusal of matter and its form of reproduction, especially in terms of the sexual relation with which the man ties himself to the legacy of the flesh, of which the devil is lord, together with all the world of matter, begin to appear. Right? There is a strict morality. In fact, even sex was considered as an extremely negative thing in terms of even Christianity at the time was Orthodoxy was disciplining certain moral behaviors and so on. But you understand here the extreme, right? And this Catharism, especially in Aquitaine, where this would come mostly to spread at some levels, it's been studied also from a psychological point of view, and that's dichotomy of the the idea of extreme poverty and extreme wealth, and the contrast that this provided did create in a world was not ready, at least had not developed the intellectual system to justify that process, in produced this kind of even schizophrenic attitudes, right? We have loads of examples, even of nobility, especially from the women in southern France, that all of a sudden abandoned all their goods. They took their vows, but as you know, even in here we can't talk about all the various monastic reforms, but there was properly already a trend set there. The trend of chastity, the trend of of abandoning the earthly goods and so on. But the whole society had not seen it all in one block. So a movement that preached this, systematically, this absolute, and rigorous discipline that, as I understand it, is even just anti-physiological, right? And don't under-evaluate, even in here, the case of schizophrenia or other stories that we find in many other contexts, not just of this time, but in the presence of this, absolute devotion. There are people who are feeling in this way, who are feeling to be more emotional than rational, that need to express their feelings in this, sometimes in these extreme ways, in things that do not appear to be, orthodox in this regard, exactly, right? And you can see in many fields of society, right? There are always these extremes. There is always this dichotomy in many ways. The Cathars were bringing here, whether the contact between with the Bogomils was decisive or not, but they were bringing now a different attitude towards these issues that naturally were very dangerous, especially for their doctrinal foundation. It was absolutely irreconcilable in this regard, at least in the most extremistic forms, surely with the Christian dogma of the time. The Cathars abstained themselves even from meat through which they believed that they perpetuated the reign of corruption would be perpetuated. They preached with the pater, the sole prayer that could be directly ascribable to Christ, denying the dogmas elaborated by the church. Their adepts were men and women, right, laymen or clergymen. The presence of women is very important in these movements because to them were allowed certain, even, for example, preaching or conferring the sacraments. This is what, for example, made the relations between the Roman Church and the Valdensians going downhill. This started from local communities that thought that to be actually a radical thing, and that where you can read that was much more than just a dogmatic point. It was about what society that these people wanted to create could work like. But there were also many noblemen as much as many peasants, right? And this is very interesting because it shows what we were telling before, that the success that not just in a social sense but also in a political one, and not just in a class one, in a class direction, these things were created, right? There were many noblemen who saw that as actually a positive aspect, even if they didn't embrace the most extremistic, like if it didn't have just a mystic crisis and abandoning all their goods, but properly supporting this church and also spotting the obvious advantages that could derive from managing these communities were very large, right? So it was also a matter of business in many ways. And they also, however, naturally left how much they possessed, however, to make themselves itinerant apostles of the new doctrine, right? As we'll see, this wealth would go in common. There were many communistic, collectivistic tendencies in these movements as well, right? And it's not that the Christianity was devoid of them, of course, but this was more markedly. And this is interesting because, once again, it's the same tendencies we find in heterodoxy in other areas of Europe and the Mediterranean, happening like that. And Saint Bernard, and this was in line, after all, with, certain Christian aspects were undeniable, so much that the Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, that knew the Cathars in southern France would say actually that, if you question them, nothing is more Christian than these heretics, right? He recognized we're heretics, but he actually said, these people are behaving in a much more Christian way, even if they're wrong about the dogmas, than most Christians we know. Naturally, St. Bernard had also kind of a moralistic point to make, but, for stating that, obviously this was a concrete thing, right? He said their behavior is irreprehensible, right? Their acts are in agreement with their words. That is an enormous deal, right? What's all about in Christianity, the idea of sinning and repenting, but falling again into temptation and sin. So these people actually did fly straight. They had something to say in terms of Christian moral standards. And in fact, he also adds, for what concerns their moral, they do not fool anyone. They do not betray anyone. They don't oppress anyone. They don't inflict any, damage to anyone. Their cheeks are white because of fasting. They don't eat the bread of otium, say, of laziness. They are fed from the work of their hands. This was, think about all the various monastic reforms, think about the Benedictine ideal and what all that had meant for the new monastic orders that were forming, right? Think about, in fact, the Saint Dominicans and Franciscans, how they would conceive their life in many ways. And there was a debate even here around work, but the idea that everything had to be possessed in common, as in the original Christian communities, was deeply felt, was the model in many ways. So what is important is that up to this point, these years, that few that we know about the Cathar doctrinal apparatus is not very far from just a rigorous reading of the Gospel and even of St. Paul's position, where the counterposition between God and Mammon, between Christ and the devil, the prince of this world, as the Cathars called them, derived from the necessity to explain and justify the presence of evil in the order of creation that was still wanted by a good God, right? This is important because what Gnosticism, for example, is about. It's this idea that after all, there's some branches of it, that the system is the other way around, that actually the devil is the good God, and that is being concealed to us by the Orthodoxy, and that this is a way of controlling us and preventing us. Think about the myth of the cavern of Plato, right? It all descends from millenary ideals, right? Here, the Cathars, of course, were in line, after all, even with the correct order. They didn't believe, largely, that this world was, not created by a good God. Just thought that most of this world is evil, right? And, Christianly speaking, this is somewhat correct. Like, the idea that, of course, there is no justice in this world, that there is no perfection in this world, it can be attained by definition, that everything that matters truly is spiritual, it's not material, right? This is Christ's words. And so the terms of this moderate dualism, as we could call them, to which the Cathar communities in Europe were attained, are being depicted by Borst, that studied them, is one of the greatest historians of Catharism, as the heretics are the true children of God, right? They are good and just, and they do all that a Christian has to do. They are Cathari, that is pure. And they say that their time has yet not come, but that everywhere they progress in the world, and their organization, their rites become more known, and their dogma is great, even more explicitated, and there is not but one God that the devil has helped in his creation. Think about this. This is very, it's not even heterodox, it's properly, against the Christian dogmas. Christ is not at all incarnated, and this is true. This for the Nicene Creed. is not incarnated in this land at all, because the evil reigns in this land. The human souls themselves are not of this world. They are angels that from dawn of times have been overthrown from the sky, and they have to finally return there after death, right? So think even about the connection in this regard between the human soul, the angels, the creation, etc. So this shows that there wasn't still an open paritetic opposition between God and the devil, right? You know, that the presence of whom was still read, in fact, as subordinated to the divinity, right? And this moderate form, that is proper, in fact, of Bulgarian Bogomilism, is being interpreted as the base of Western Catharism. As a consequence, had, however, to evolve towards more radical forms, right? Because of all the instances that we have noticed in this extremely violent and turbulent society in the West, some scholars identified the constitution of absolute dualists, right? Of current in a group of Bogomils that survived the persecutions in the area of Constantinople, brought up once again the Manichaean contraposition between a God, Lord of the Light and of the Spirit, and of his eternal antagonist, the Lord of the Darkness and of Evil, Creator of Matter. Right, so two complementary figures in many ways for the cosmic order. Right, is a great clash between good and evil. Right, and don't think that Christianity is that far, historically speaking, from that. Just read the hymn to the Logos of the prologue of St. John's Gospel. That's extremely close to Iranian dualism, and it's, in my opinion, it's my favorite actually part of the Bible. But it's dramatic, right? You know, it really gives you this vision that, and we could digress on actually how much this was connected with other, let's say, cultural legacies that existed in Europe, even through, for example, the I don't even know how to put this, but properly the Iranian influence of the peoples of the steppes of certain environments, about which we know dramatically few, but that have to be connected even with Arianism, with certain vision of properly of the divinity in the European meaning of it. If you look at the etymology, even just of the of the word God as pure light, as diffused, it's all connected with the the glory of the skies of violence. So it's extremely complex. We can't here. You understand the power of these implications, but we can't, because the video is we can't digress. The video is too long, the way it is. But the important here is that under the light of such conception, that is decisively extraneous and incompatible with Christianity, as you understand, the scriptural witnesses were radically re-elaborated at some point. Right, it was denied every value of the Old Testament. This is also typical. The idea that think about Marcionism, already said this thing. It's all about those evil Jews that wrote the Old Testament, right? And the God of the Christians is the new one, is the positive one. So, in fact, Gnosticism. We made I think a very interesting video about how Gnosticism was refused in the 3rd century Rome by the Christian community of Rome. It had this deep anti-Semitic and Gnostic characters, right? The Marcionism specifically, and this thing was popping out once again in the 12th century, denying the Old Testament. Like, what good would you think that this would have come? I mean, in general history of, do you have the scale of what's the of course the Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, all the New Testament together had brought to Europe in terms of how the world political and social order had been, with extreme difficulty, with extreme patience and time, with a great negotiation, had been created, set the basis of our war. So, in many ways, I want to think that these movements were somewhat doomed since the beginning, but I'm not a determinist, but I realized that these instances were too radical. There was no space in Europe, given its potentials and its needs of reorganization, to escape like a kind of a rational approach to this reality. Right, the triumph of Aristotelianism, eventually over Platonism, with scholastics, was exactly the victory of orthodoxy over heterodoxy, and this claims here, right? The denial of the Old Testament, that these were the years in the 11th to the 12th century in which anti-Judaism was revived in Europe, where Jews were massacred all over, every time there was a new crusade, or just because the local population wanted so. It was mostly actually devoid of ideological connections, just they wanted to steal Jewish money, after all. And of course were spoiled also by the ideology that the Jews were, just specializing, not all of them by the way, in this money lending activity, because that was forbidden by law for the Christians, even though actually in this same centuries the rule was being abandoned. Notoriously, medieval Christianity had an enormous money lending activity. So this was justified in most stupid, ridiculous, and violent ways. And when you think about the poor Cathars that were being burned at the stake, think about the anti-Semitism that also was contained in part of their movement, and the thing that these people had done, for example, to the Jews, and not all, right, even to other parts of society, people had actually earned their money, including both the church but also lay people. So there were a lot of social class instances as well in here, right? Don't think that all these masses of the dispossessed, even not just the poorest classes, but think about all these cadet knights that went around raping, slaughtering on a regular basis because simply they didn't have anything, any other way to survive. Like would read the stuff in a radical way, and especially from a psychological view, in this idea of repenting themselves from the obvious violence they were committing. If anything, ideologically before in practice, because naturally by Christian standards you sin with the mind, not with the actions, right? And this is fundamental as well. So it's the inherent torment and contrast in these people's souls that would bring to the extreme and radical claims, right? And probably, as we were saying before, the worst thing in absolute terms for medieval Christian orthodoxy, as it was shared by the majority of the population, was the denial of the new in the materiality of Christ. I mean, the dogma of incarnation is that we can see as Christians our own God in human form, and this is all about Christian civilization and its humanistic ideal is about. Christianity is a hymn to humanity. Without the dogma of incarnation, we wouldn't have all the unquantifiable and crushing and overwhelming and uncountable amount of art. Go across Europe and see what cathedrals, our Christian art, our beauty, the hymn to human God and his mother. Think about Bernard de Clairvaux. We made an entire video on the reevaluation of the woman in this by orthodoxy, not only actually, because that was kind of borderline, it was still a Neoplatonic ideal in some ways, but think about the same value of human goodness. This is also from what our human rights come from, that they are actually a product of Western civilization inspired to equality that didn't exist before Christianity in the West by any stretch of the imagination. This is it's unspeakable, right? And this is where I am convinced these things were doomed since the beginning. It's maybe an intellectual limit. I give it to you. It's intellectual deafness, but a movement that in 12th century Europe, right, could deny the dogma of incarnation could not make an headway, right? And somewhat called for its own annihilation, because in many ways this is also what they also believed. I mean, the idea that of course this world is evil. Who could win if not evil? They knew they were doomed, and that's why they also believed in that way, right? This is a deep realization. Don't think it's like these were just evil. Think about the human experience of these people. Think about what they believed. And think about how this happened in this world, in these times and places. And there is a reason for it, right? So, together with the dogma of incarnation, of course, Jesus was absolutely not seen as being born, for example, as a mortal man. The tradition of mediation between human and divine, it was entrusted to the Virgin, was denied, was renegated as seat of the incarnation. So I think, whatever you want to think like, but just think about, you tell a Christian in the 12th century that believes in these things, that this stuff is not true. It's as if, like, in parallel, just to make, an anachronistic and, of course, forced comparison, but it's as if today you came to this world, and what is that we believe the most, after all, in general, we're making a lot of effort and force in human rights, for example. Someone on the right says, after all, human rights maybe can do without. And when you think about parallelism, what is that is claiming that? Think about people in the world today that think, for example, that a race has more rights than another one. Isn't that the denial of human rights? And in what range of the political spectrum do they fit? In the extremism, right? And they have communistic tendencies, and they use violence, and they justify this violence in many ways. They justify a secessionistic, a split in society. They deny that the Orthodoxy, the foundation of this society. Now, these groups have always existed historically, and they've always remained a fringe. Right, that has helped also the Orthodoxy. We couldn't be a society without this extremistic fringe and work well, properly, because this is something you find in every society. But just think about the content of the meaning. Right? Think about the content of the meaning, and we will see many interesting parallelisms in here. Now, things started to go pretty seriously wrong, also in a political and in ecclesiological terms at this point, because this radical vision that admitted the equal value of God and the devil, and therefore the clash between a principle of good and evil, are right in the West, once again from the East, right from Constantinople, because around 1167, Nicetas, there was a Bogomil bishop of the radical church of Constantinople, visited in Milan the chief of the Italian heretics. You know that, as we were saying before, the most productive areas of the West now were the seat of this. Think about the Cathars, the Evangelical movement, the Valdensians, These are the richest areas in Europe, like the Po Valley, southern France, the Rhine Valley. These are the areas where, in fact, this is more spread. This heretic was known as Mark, and Nicetas gained him to the cause of the Cathar church of Dragovica. It was this church of Balkans that saw in Satan, as we've seen, a parallel deity to God. And Nicetas elevated Mark to episcopal dignity as well. They actually traveled together across France, where in the May of the same 1167, in Saint-Félix-de-Carmont, close to Toulouse, the French Cathar communities gathered in a council. So in this seat, the Cathars perfected the coordinates of the movement. It was now organized as a church, as a true one. And this is the big step, right? They were creating a parallel church to the Roman one, based on this heretical, not just heterodox, properly heretical, according to the Nicene Creed, doctrine. And at the light, in fact, under the light of this dogmatic principles of radical dualism. So this brought to a doctrinal unity combination that united the Cathars of Constantinople with the one of Aquitaine, right? And under the guide of a hierarchy of bishops that were preposed to specific territorial districts, right? So what had been traditionally the Roman Catholic ecclesiastical administration since the time of the Roman Empire all over Christian Europe, except maybe for Ireland that didn't know cities up to a certain point and therefore had invented more like a country monastic simple but the system, but all over Europe the diocesan system had prevailed. literally everywhere. Like there wasn't even a single country. It didn't work like that. And this was a dramatic challenge because naturally the church had its own administration everywhere in this regard. And together with that worked also the lay forces. So, by the way, this church could have not existed in this regard if it hadn't already been backed by some of the local hierarchies in many ways. This is dramatic because you have properly a territorialized reality that can compare as a political and social system, as an alternative, as a fully accomplished church to the Catholic Roman one, while the theme of reformation of the customs and in the adherence of to the spirit and the letter of the gospel, by remaining present within the Cathar message, lost of importance during the ecclesiastical institutionalization of the movement. This other big mistake. These guys basically start as in many ways. When the ideology is obviously utopistic, and you try to make it work in reality, the utopia dies, because utopias are called utopias for one reason, and humans work dramatically similarly, much more than we think. So what do? They create a church that had allegedly to be, much better on the basis of this moral purity of the Cathars compared to the Roman Catholic one. They create this church, and what they abandon is exactly their moral standards. So Reformation, what happened, and maybe the Roman Catholic Church had so many difficulties for reforming itself because, certain demands were utopistic. They were actually doing their best to maintain the thing together, to make it work in the first place, right? You can't criticize the monarchic turn of the Catholic Church. You can't compare to the previous centuries, to the Gregorian form, whatever. But what do these guys do? They create something like that. And surprise, surprise, it works exactly, with the same problems. Because in the 12th century, you can't create something that is not corrupted, by definition. There's no centralized state, and even centralized states are corrupted normally. But still, this society here cannot work in any other manner. The more, it's kind of ridiculous how, people criticize, for example, the moral standards of the church in comparison to the secular ones. If society sucks, chances are that the church sucks as well. And so it is, right? Let's leave aside enormous problems of, think about the Catholic Church, like pedophilia, all the stuff that are an evident macroscopic problem. But think about it in terms of all the times you hear, like, historically speaking, the church always thought about his own money. Yeah, because what all the other people did actually think about. The church was a principality at this point, like any other thing. Why should they have worked any different? And do you know what did actually the church do in the meanwhile? Do people discuss the work of civilization done by something called scholastics for the scientific values in medieval civilization? Did they know why that was done? What it did actually correspond to, not just in ideological or scientific terms, but properly in political and social terms? And do you know what the people of the time thought of it? These are questions that we should ask in a world that is going exactly under the same problems that, of course, every other society, including historically, like this one, has gone to. Obviously, with its own differences, with its own, specifics, but generally speaking, in ways that we could understand if we just realized that conflict, for example, is universal in human society. That every person that pretends to create a perfect society is an idealist, and as long as this idealist remains, in fact, a fringe, everything is fine. Right? When these radicals take power, something like National Socialism, or Soviet Union, or Maoist China happen, which means hundreds of millions of people killed, right? And you can't think that this is just like a coincidence, because, guess what were the ideologies of those realities that killed as many people out there? compared to the world standards of the time, right? You can't say things like, the conquistadores killed more people than normally what the Aztecs did, because it's wrong and it's false. So you can't criticize the morals of this time, but once you acknowledge that, the Christian Europeans and the pagan Native Americans were basically just a bunch of murderous people, you have two options. Either you stop studying history, or you maybe start seeing the goodness that existed here and there, and you start to make an assessment, realizing that maybe it is among the endless bloodbath that happened historically all over, maybe there was something that was created at the time that is the reason why today we don't do that stuff anymore in the same measure, right? And why we improved, right? And in this sense, I want to even speak in not necessarily in positive or negative terms about the Cathars, but as I was saying before, let's reflect why these things happened, right? I just make a bit more of criticism towards the Cathars because I believe that this is where my bias comes from, as you understand. But generally speaking, they weren't all evil. Like, every society doesn't have all evil people, and we can't even think that these were worse than others. We just have to try to understand the human behind that, right? And we can't stigmatize them justly. Just trying to understand their history and then speak. So, in this new church, the perfects that were the priests, essentially, that's how the Cathars called their priests, the perfects, right? To those was, for example, allowed through the imposition of the hands, the consolamentum, as it was called in Latin, to initiate the faithful, assumed a special charisma, the one of the puri, right? So, of course, the pures, a terrible condition, actually, of austerity, right? For the safeguard of which was allowed the endura, that was the suicide with which you could put an end to the eternal temptation of the flesh, right? This was contemplated, but to which the simple believers were not obliged to uniform, but from which were also detached in this regard. So the aversive patrimony of a pauperism that was intended as refusal of property and of profit, that had been proper of the evangelical Catharism of the origins, was destined to influence also other movements. For example, less than 10 years after the Council of Saint-Félix-de-Caramont, the Valdensians would appear, right, were taken in turn on their own, but as adversaries of the Cathars. And always think about this, right? There is a reason maybe why the Valdensians still exist, historically speaking. It's because they decided, in spite of the very harsh repression that were enforced on them, but they were born as enemies of the Cathars, right? This is extremely important, and this shows, at least they retook this conceptions of apostolic poverty. And the example of the Valdensians, in my opinion, is extremely important, because they were exactly the same thing of the Cathars, but they didn't buy into the heterodoxy of the radical, dualism. And they were claiming themselves, as you know, the Valdensians didn't break up with Rome immediately. It was actually a very positive dialogue between the two, up to when Valdes, or at least, or him refused, to conform to the local authority in France, also because of the matter of the women priests, right? And all this stuff. But they were born as anti-Cathars. That is, the same Pauperistic-Evangelical movements realized that largely what the Cathars were doing was pretty much insane, right? And they were fiercely against them. And don't think about, ideas. These people killed each other, literally. So that's the peaceful and, mitigated context we're talking about, right? And, if you kill a person in the 12th century, it's not that, as we were saying before, the authorities are everywhere, they can punish you. These people, maybe you destroy entire farms or houses, and even people who have nothing to do with the problem, and who's going to control you? Someone has to do something about that, right? And it's the Lord usually, or the bishop, that it can be the same people actually, that when start seeing that, taxes, the tax incomes have gone down because an entire freaking part of the country has been wiped out, and you start saying, maybe we should do something about this. And that's where the authority and the intelligence of a civilization sets itself in motion. So when you think of repression, start thinking what stemmed for, because in the meanwhile, it's not just that the guy realized the thing from the tax records. There was a lot of people that were going to him and saying, we have been started to be killed and robbed, right, and raped, and all the worst thing imaginable that you can think, that, as we were saying before, happened anyway, because those lords and their bands of thugs around did the same exact thing, but still in a more intelligent way, at least doing it against their political enemies in that regard, but still trying to build in their own land an order, right? And that's as brutal as civilization goes. Yes, civilization also emerges from these crimes, and there is no doubt about it, unfortunately. But it was, generally speaking, surely the higher voice of reason in a society that here was losing some of the plot, in my opinion, or at least that was let being free to do it, was letting its radical fringes free to do whatever they want, and that's where the authority is necessary to build. Think about, but I don't know. Think about the terrorism in a close example. Not just in, okay, we could talk even about the ISIS in unfortunately in recent years in Europe, and how in the United States, and how much we have enforced this in terms of legal terms of how we have tightened certain freedoms, all this. But that's a necessity. Think about black and red terrorism in the Western Bloc during the Cold War. I mean, lots of people died, even much more than the ones that ISIS killed at the time. And of course, at the time, our states tightened up. We needed to counter them in a way. What's better, that you lose a little bit of your freedom, but at least you don't get blown up in the street? Of course, there is a ratio, because it's not like if you don't do it, you die automatically. It's still a minimal part of the population. But think about the sense of insecurity and the economical loss, the instability that derives from a country where someone can kill other people without punishment. I think that pacification, public order, public security is actually the first concern of every state worth of this name, because if you don't have that, you can't have a healthy life. You can't have an economical. Your rights are not respected simply because you can't do what you're intimidated, and you can't work. Right, so that's an extremely important point. Aside from the Valdensians, in the meanwhile, Catharism had become, especially thanks to its institutional organization, the most fearsome enemy of the Catholic Church. This is particularly important because, as we will see, it was an enormous area of southern France that had reasons for on the base of many historical precedents to feel itself detached both from Italy, both from France, in some ways even from Spain. But seen as as an entity on its own, they wanted to create something on its own, something alternative, if you want. Consider that just one century before, the concept of for example, a sole center of Christianity didn't quite understand. The only 1 century before, the feudal monarchies were much weaker, right? So don't be surprised that someone tried to come out of that, or at least to carve itself its own niche, but failing, and unfortunately for them, paying very bitterly for it. So the achieved homogeneity of doctrinal contents was confirmed, however, also within the Cathar Church, that to every dogma can correspond an heresy. Right? So what do the heretics start doing? They start condemning people for heresy themselves. So, once again, when you think about Cathars being slaughtered, think about what they were normally doing themselves, right? How often, seriously, how often someone ever told, about this, in this pietistic articles on the internet of, all the poor Cathars were butchered down, but even the innocents, because this happened, this actually happened. Horrible stuff, horrible crime, disgusting. But in terms of perspective and in criticism, has any of these articles said that you can remember? I ask you individually, that the Cathars had developed an anti-heretical repression themselves, right? That could be surely interpreted in terms of, anti-Catholic in this sense, but that's exactly the same thing the Catholics were doing in this regard. Who has ever told it to you, right? I may be the first person. So, the problem with that actually is that more than the Catholics, the Catholic society was facing internal problems, schisms, divisions, right? So this wasn't at all the happy utopia that they were thinking to create. It was actually a pretty messed up thing that naturally most of the people would even live there that had all the interest to back maybe some kind of autonomistic policies in many regard from the French kingdom, the Church of Rome, wouldn't like. Because if you deny the dogma of incarnation, well, that's not Christianity, right? That's something else, right? You can interpret what Christianity is, but historically speaking, as a path of civilization, a cultural path, it's still a different thing, right? Aside from what the name can be, you can call it even, goofy or whatever, but it's still something inherently, essentially different that is also being formulated by many other philosophies, including Manichaeism, as we've seen, other, ones that, by the way, took inspiration from Christianity as well, because money was actually, it was the thing that was emerging from a melting pot that surely had enormous influence, but also that's actually posterior to Christianity itself. And as a consequence of these repressions, guess who were wiped out in this phase of first expansion of the church, of which these guys had been themselves shepherds? First Nicetas and then Mark, right? As it often happens, think about Trotsky, think about all these figures, made the thing and then were wiped out, right, for very concrete interests, or very political interests, right, in this fringe revolutionary things. Together with the Italian Cathar community, for example, entered at the time in contact a small group of Bogomils who were actually moderate, and headed by a bishop named Petrachius, that brought the disastrous news that Nicetas' predecessor, Simon, having been surprised with a woman, what a terrible thing, couldn't be deemed as pure. Oh no. And as such, he didn't possess the necessary charisma to impart the consolamenta or to invest of the episcopal authority. So, and just think about even the standards. So according to you, how many Cathars were actually sexually abstinent? Rhetorical question. So again, the purity and the effectiveness of the teaching and of the sacramental act were subordinated to the personal integrity of the priests, just as it had happened for the Catholic ones. You know that the Gregorian reform brought, for example, for the first time, formally and officially, the chastity of the clergy. Right before the 11th century, it was normal for a priest or a bishop or even for a pope actually to have children. It wasn't considered a big deal. I mean, it was already seen since late antiquity as a, kind of a distracting thing, because naturally, everything with moderation, right? That's the point. You don't have to be to go straight from your spiritual duties first of all. But among the Cathars, this seems to have been used as a weapon, think about virtue signaling, right? Nicetas episcopal title that he had received from Simon decayed, right? And it was also automatically invalid, the one that Nicetas had conferred to Mark, and that from Mark had passed to his successor in Lombardy, John the Judean. Does it remember to you something? Right, first of all, this is the typical Donatistic heresy that had already happened in the 4th century Africa. The idea, if the priest that gives you the sacrament is not pure, the sacrament is not valid. Well, this was absolutely rejected, because actually, the priest is just a mean, and the only thing that matters, or in Orthodox terms, is how much you're actually repented, and in this sense, how much you're spiritually, deserve God's forgiveness. The formality of it and what the priest has done, is it has nothing to do with the validity of your sacrament, as long as you are truly repented for your sins. Interestingly enough, this was the same heresy that St. Augustine, that was a Manichaean himself in his youth, as you know, bitterly fought, right, and raising as bishop of Hippo in Africa back in the day. It was the same exact thing. So these guys were, as you know, there is just a revival of things that had always happened, right? I would like to stress the connection that exists with things like virtue signaling and this disgusting fake morality that is being presented to us from the media in terms of, we're all pure, there are angelic figures that never do any harm, and that we should take as, models of virtue and purity just because they're so kind of cute. We are freaking human beings. I would say that the realization that we are all sinners and that we should be, upset by that, but also not for this, preventing ourselves to live a fulfilled life and doing actually something positive that can make us proud of doing something positive is a very good anthropological view, right? Starting stigmatizing people and saying, that guy's not pure, so let's wipe him out, right? Does it remember something of our days? Think about it. So, thrown in the discomfort and in the most absolute insecurity, the Italian Cathars, among which could be already identified in a remarkable richness of internal articulations of more regional groups, split trying to find new sources of legitimacy. Right. The interesting aspect is that, the comparison with our own times is that in today's times, people who claim purity are just a bunch of underschooled no-ones that, have never done anything in their lives. These people at the time, I think, had a slightly higher moral standards. Like, these people, if anything, truly feared for the salvation of their soul. Right, this is something that is often overlooked, right, independently from the fact that these people actually understood theology, which is debatable in many ways, because what do you think that the actual theological awareness of an average 12th century person, independently of her own faith, could actually be, and we perfectly know this from the sources. But, even if they had remained a more pagan or even superstition mindset, of course these people believed in things like hell, right, and heaven. They cared extremely for themselves, for their families. So I don't want to ridiculize this, right? But it's obvious that there is something strange about it in some ways. But surely, I presume most of these people generally cared about these issues. I mean, they truly felt, that priest wasn't good, so what the hell do we do now as a church? We must find another leader that is pure. So what the Italians did specifically was to recur to the Ordo Druguntia, that is the mother church of radical dualism that, as we have seen, had developed in Dragovica. For example, the Florentine Cathars the ones of the Spoleto Valley and the ones of the Garda Lake, they reverted to it. And this is interesting because it apparently, at least these groups didn't follow a personal criterion, but actually a communitary one, right? Just, as for the Catholics, there was the Roman Church, and that was the moral point of reference. Here, the Church of Dragovica seemed to be, things stem from there. Let's look at them. There were others, like the Milanese, for example, that instead brought back to the original moderate dualism of the Bulgarian order. Some others, such as the Cathars of the new churches in Mantua, Bagnolo, and Vicenza, addressed for consecration their own bishops towards a group of Bogomils of Bosnia that up to that point hadn't compromised too much themselves in the West, because, as we've seen, Bosnia was a relatively, let's say, isolated region in the Balkans, and after all, they hadn't created many problems around, instead, like the Cathars in southern France. It's a very big society, actually, and a wealthy and powerful one did. So, at the end of the 12th century, the Italian Cathar communities found themselves split into 6 bishoprics with 3 different creeds, right? This is often, once again, what happens with utopias, that everybody believes in the thing, and then it seems that everything works well until reality happens and nobody knows what to do, because that's an utopia, right? And they split, and this irremediably brings to weakness. So such divisions are not to be explained just on the basis of doctrinal contrasts, or, for example, the personal ones between the exponents of radical and moderate dualism that did exist for sure, but they rather reveal, more in general, the practical, in fact, difficulties of management of a movement that had grown and that rendered necessary a different and more minute organization, especially of the pastoral care, right? These things, as we've seen, had grown in a territorial sense. So there were literally people, communities that had to be disciplined, and they had to have specific cadres of points of references, and this is a big problem, especially if you've started in an idealistic way, and the truth is that you have not the slightest idea what to do. I think also of recent parallelisms, but I don't want to point them out, because otherwise you think I'm too biased, and after the beginning you would say I'm somewhat hypocritical. But the important is that in spite of such problems, the Cathars continued to incarnate the ideal of perfect apostolic adherence in some ways, increasing constantly their own ranks, right? There were people coming from everywhere, actually, and in spite of their deep contradiction between the evangelical ethics and a dogma that is even contrary to the monotheistic thought, because objectively dualism is a bitheism. You conceive that there is not a single God. There is God and the devil, that they are equal in power. That's pretty messed up, right? Also in monotheistic terms. So this irreconcilable split had, a distance, had already appeared clearly by 1178 in Toulouse. There was the most important center in southwestern France. In fact, would become the main center of political backing of the Cathars, when the Cathar bishops of the region organized, backed by the backed politically and militarily, think about it, by the small local lords, right? This is extremely important. A public contradictory in front of a papal legate, declaring actually a perfect Christian creed. That was, however, based on the recognition of 2 antithetical deities. You see, this is extremely important, because it shows you how, in the political pragmatism, these people understood what the problem was, and even if they were, they weren't just, extremists at by in absolute terms. They realized if they wanted to hope to survive, or they didn't want to have trouble, they had to show that after all they were in agreement with Roman Catholicism, or with Orthodoxy in the first place. So the only thing that they actually didn't give up was the idea that the devil was not like in Christian Orthodoxy, like the kind of theatrical figure that is being culturally created, but actually a non place, like just it's the lack of God properly in Orthodox terms. But on the contrary, there is actually another God, and this is, as we've seen, actually pretty complicated as well, because it's not even monotheistic, and this presents an enormous problem. It means, if anything, that God is not omnipowerful. How do you explain that? Or at least he's as powerful as the devil. What is fascinating is the support of the local nobility. Smaller noblemen, right? Not just like the enormously powerful nobility of the northern French kingdom, right? But, Occitania had a more equal distribution of wealth. Right? It was very wealthy. It was similar somewhat to Central and Northern Italy in many ways. Probably was even closer to it than to other areas of close to it. But the point, and especially with Spain actually, surely more than with Northern France, but these people were backing something that could say, here we are, something different in the international arena. And political and military support, what does it mean? It means that the Cathars went armed, and not just with sticks or other stuff, just pilgrims, and could have, right, a bunch of martyrs that followed the Crusader trains, just to pillage and around. No, we're talking about knights. We're talking about the professional elite in medieval warfare. So think about the innocents, broadly meant, wherever you picture them, like you want to think them from. So what struck the contemporaries was the very high moral example of Catharism, right? Especially considering their ecclesiastical organization, right? It was articulated this double level of the perfects and of the believers, and that rendered possible a compromise between the absolute severity, as we've seen, that was demanded to the first, and the wide margin of tolerance granted to the latter. At an economical level, in fact, Catharism propagated apostolic poverty, and every prefect, by entering the sect, had to hand out all his property to the church, right? Other interesting stuff. When you want to create a church and you have a territorial administration, you must have wealth to rule that, right? And that's exactly what the papal monarchy had done, right, since 1 century. So the trick here is, of course, that all this wealth is in common, yes, but there's always someone who controls it, who administers it, who guards it, sword in hands, or at least his own knights having. So once again, think about it. The idea was that naturally the prefect would at that point have to work with his own hands. To the poverty of the master had to correspond, in this sense, the wealth of the church. In a sense, it was the meaning, but also the one of the simple believers, to whom was not required, as we've seen, the renunciation to the goods, nor interdicted, for example, the exercise of usury. Right? So this is also interesting because you see that this society encompassed actually different levels of political, institutional, socio-economical organization. Among the Cathars, you had the perfect ones who wanted to dedicate themselves to abstinence, to the renunciation of any earthly good. They were, from one other hand, allowing members of their church to even practice usury, which was actually forbidden, for example, by the Roman Church. Then they invented other ways of making it anyway, and Christians did it anyway. As we were saying before, there was no way to actually control it, but at least, it was forbidden, because, interest was considered as a product of the devil, because it was not a real value, right? And this naturally speaks in part even with communistic origins of Christianity, but in practice, as we were saying before, civilization realizes that there is really nothing wrong with free market, and that the Roman Church was the first capitalist in this regard in the picture, extremely jealous of its own prerogatives and possessions and so on. So also in this Catharism, having developed as an institution founded on a dogma and on a hierarchy, had to mutuate from the Catholic Church a certain evolutional typology that in fact split in practice the moral quality of the sacerdotal class from the one of the faithful. While against other movements that persecuted more coherently than the Cathars, the Pauperistic choices, the Church basically decided to take a repressive action quite soon, right? Backed especially by groups of lay power that, with the ecclesiastical hierarchy, shared the functions of ruling class in Europe, right? And the Catharism, in this sense, also gave proof that on a political level of a great capacity of compromising and negotiation to adapt to the environment in which they operate. They knew, as we were saying before, that they were surrounded by wolves, and potentially that's what they wanted to become themselves. So projected into an antagonistic dimension, but at the same time, imitating the same Catholic institution, the model for building up the Cathar Church was exactly the Roman Catholic one. There weren't any other, right? There weren't any other for Western Christian. What's the model of a church? Rome. Which one should it be? That was the only church. So the Cathar movement became ever more conditioned by the social reality in which it operated, right? It could be, for example, the society torn apart by factional contracts like the Italian communes in the first half of the 13th century, within which it, by the way, matured also complex endogenous reasons, the tenacious support given to the heretics by Ghibellinism. We will have to speak of that later. Or, for example, the complex articulation of the local powers of the Occitan region that was threatened in its political autonomy by the centralizing orientation of the French crown. Right. So Capitani defined such attitude of the Cathars as a mimetic aggregation. That points out the most obvious interaction between Catharism and Roman Catholicism that couldn't to determine, but in turn, an extremely intense clash, right? And just think about the whole mindset of the time. Like, it's not that the so-called popular opinion, public opinion, was born like in the 18th century with journals and gazettes. Like, if in 12th century Europe was another church that stated, you know what, after all we can do on our own, and yeah, like the devil is as powerful as God, but don't mind, we're perfect Christians otherwise. Well, chances are that people all around would notice, wouldn't they? And this actually spread a lot of anxiety and in the West, right? There was, as we have seen already, not particularly happy in spite of this tumultuous growth, because it was an unregulated, in fact, unrestricted growth. But as we have seen, violences, wars, epidemics, systemic failures would emerge ever more frequently in spite of the absolute growth, right? That made people reading this novelty as a dangerous sign of the time. The multitude of the heretics that that were all together with other major problems, like, for example, the failure of the Third Crusade in the same years. What's wrong with us? We had conquered Jerusalem. The Second Crusade didn't go well. 30 years after, the third one doesn't go well. Did God abandon us? We're failing God, actually. Many people think that. Always think that the prevalent thought now that it would be eventually a more a greater faith in humanity, human capability in this regard, emerging from all of this crisis, as it often happens, fortunately, proving the civilization solving problem-solving capabilities, right, that saw the world in constant decay, right? Orbis senescit, this was the term, like the idea that, of course, things had to go always worse until the come of the Antichrist. Then Christ would come a second time and crush the Antichrist, and then at the end of times, Judgment's Day, I mean, it would be the kingdom of a heaven on earth, and etc. So the thing here was seen in ever more dramatic terms, right? The Christians felt that they were failing to defend now the heart itself of their historical tradition. So various voices began to rise at the time against, for example, the useless waste of energies that were destined to fight the distant Saracen enemy, while everywhere in the same West prospered the most dangerous adversaries of Christ, right? Unfortunately, anti-Semitism broke out once again. The Jews were pointed, of course, as the day-seeds of the situation, but especially in this heretical context, the false apostles that in the name of Christ, in fact, were denying the possibility of the promised salvation and redemption. So gradually was maturing that climate of mobilization, right? That would have transferred within, inwards to Christianity. The holy war that up to that point had been fought only against the external enemies, the infidels, right? And already in the Lateran Council, the Third Lateran Council of 1179, the spiritual benefits for those who left in defense of the Holy Land were extended to those who would have taken arms against the Albigensian heretics. Albigensian comes from the city of Albi in southern France because of the strong concentration of the sect in the city. So from Albi, the Cathars of southwestern France took their name, or called by others at least. But it was only under Innocent III that was by far not just one of the greatest popes in the history of Christendom, but also the single most powerful pope in relative terms, right? Under Innocent III, you had the peak of papal power in Europe. Basically, almost all of European powers are papal vassals, right, and recognize themselves as such. In 1208, unleashed the terrible anti-Cathar crusade in Provence, right? And today we'll not see that, but at some point we'll have to analyze properly the campaign and all the context, also with northern France, how Philip II managed the thing, and it's extremely important, in fact, connected even to the success of the French crown of universalism, scholastics, the French Papal Alliance. That's an enormous chapter, but if you know what I'm talking about, you realize what I mean. But in terms of scale, the magnitude of this phenomenon, but still, that was not to be given for granted at this point. The threat was concrete, right? And especially the papacy was backed by this widespread reaction that, as we have seen, started not just from the nobility, right? It's not just the terrible noble at the top of say, haha, we are the elite, we want to crush this free thinkers, right? No, the Valdensians, some of the poorest people out there that gathered with them, were born with an anti-Cathar feeling, right? It's not to say there's not a class clash in many circumstances, but in fact, the more that existed, the more that eluded the spiritual problem in the first place. So here we skip actually what appears naturally as the most devastating and traumatic and dark and sad and depressing side of the story. That it's what it's even being called a genocide. I'm not a fan of the term, as we were saying at the beginning, but if you look at least at the sheer amount of violence was unleashed, it's hard to believe, right? This didn't save even the Christians of those regions, right? This was truly a political question. A lot of innocents were butchered without any mercy. We all know the phrase, God will recognize his own, right? Which is often said out of context, and it's not that the context sometimes makes it sound any better, but I'm talking about an extended context in the sense that if you look at how people were regularly killed at the time, that wasn't maybe not even the worst thing you could imagine, right? Even as an end. But in this sense, the Crusaders didn't hesitate to massacre in the certainty that if those people had been good, they would have been recognized by God as ships of his herd. And it was an extermination that actually hit hard at the roots of the great Occitan cultural tradition, right? And that's why we should expand on the French political spectrum in another video, because that was properly the end of the political autonomy of the Languedoc that was aggregated, or at least sucked into the orbit of the Langue d'Oil of the Capetian monarchy, right? Actually, as you know with the story, even simply from a military point of view, Simon de Montfort fought mostly. It's not that they were disorganized, but I mean, there was Philip II sent all these aristocrats in the south to deal with the things in their own hands. Simon de Montfort rose, basically conquered almost all the Albigensian strongholds. He was a great commander. Think about the Battle of Muret. This is one of the masterpieces in the art of warfare in the 13th century, attack from the flank against the Aragonese and so on. But he died famously, killed by a mangonel shot, action by women, by the way, which was extremely insulting for a noble and in misogynistic mindset of the time, at the siege of Toulouse. And basically at his death, all this crusade had been for nothing. In fact, the Occitans regained all the power, and it was later just in the mid-century that, because of dynastic ties, eventually the Capetians would inherit the county of Toulouse. That was the major thing there, would open their, finally, their first port in the Mediterranean with construction of Aigues-Mortes, from which Louis IX would launch the various crusades against Egypt. But that's another story. In fact, we will see it on another occasion. But it's one of those cultural phenomena that you could never end speaking about, because it's really the end of an enormous tradition that we could draw back to Visigothic times, even before. Like the area was southern France was with this extreme melting pot of culture. Some of the greatest figures in the history of medieval civilization came from there. Think about the same Sylvester the second, right? Gilbert of Aurillac, one of that was actually the inspirer, together with the Ottonians, paradoxically, the same monarchic, the Gregorian form and the monarchic orientation of the church, or the Roman church in a truly universal sense. And this person's stamp for intellectual and cultural background was typical of that area, the border also with the great Islamic tradition. The crossroad of ideas of scientific, this where properly a universal scale of intellectual capacity came about, and that's what the Roman Church was fed from there on to create the universalism thing that eventually would crush the same Cathars in the area that were tied to that reality, as we've seen, for political reason, for this the autonomy of this broader area that was instead brought under the French rule in the harsh way. And we will talk about that specifically in another video. But as we've seen here, the changes were enormous just from an ecclesiological point of view, and this is what we should concentrate, because with Innocent III's decision to transfer within Christianity the logic of the just war, and therefore holy war, by the way, against the enemy of the faith, surpassing, by the way, one of the fundamental functions of the Crusade was to channel the political, economical objective of the, let's say, of the East, the frictions and the social worries, we could say, of the West, right? So war against the external in order to have peace in the internal began a dangerous ideological turn that would bring the church to make of the cross an instrument to fight not just the heretics, but in general all the enemies or the political adversaries of the papacy. Right. Even in here, we should digress powerfully on what the hell was the church doing at that point. As we've seen with Innocent III, that's the moment in which they could afford to relaunch these ideals, etc. But the relation here between the papacy and the empire is a bit too demanding for matters of time. We will address it at some point. And it's really complicated, actually. But in parallel, we could say, were extended the borders of the notion of heresy itself, right? That were ever more markedly configured like a crime of lese majesty, right? Before that, the Christianity wasn't like it, right? And in the letter that Innocent III sent to, for example, the citizens of Viterbo, that is in the region of Rome, central Italy, were suspected actually to coexist with the Cathars, to say the least, was theorized an attitude that was sanctioned contemporarily, by the way, also by the Decretal Vergentis Insenium, where the Pope stated, in fact, quote, so this is translated, it would be something like, if in virtue of the legitimate sanctions to those who are guilty of lese majesty, punished of death, or confiscated the goods, and with a merciful decision is left solely the life of their children, so much those who, going astray from faith, offend God in the person of Jesus Christ, have to be separated with this ecclesiastical censorship from our chief, our head, Christ, because it's much worse to offend the lese majesty than the temporal one. Right, so you understand what this means. My translation was a bit messy in English, actually, but I think the meaning was clear. Is that the point here is not about having to clash against the church as a temporal thing. It's about clashing against Christ himself. So whatever you say here doesn't matter. And that's like, this is something that actually in Christianity existed ever since the beginning. Like, the ancient world didn't give you freedom of conscience, but it's obvious that Christian times brought this allowed that, but like in this case, so they allowed you to go straight, but also punishing you as a consequence. But properly, the step that is taken by this decretal is to say, you're putting yourself against an enemy that you can't deal with properly. And the papacy was really that powerful at that point. So the taking of this position represented a meaningful step in the theological juridical elaboration of the monarchical power of the Pope. The repression of heresy by Rome was becoming one of the constitutive elements. Right, the Church begins now to crush this. That wasn't normal at the time. Like, nobody had ever come to the idea that, you know, it was a papal thing. Like, lay authorities were, of course, to do that in case, you know, someone had to, you know, properly to enforce law in that regard. Now, the papacy, of course, always with the cooperation of the lay war, but was taking the lead, right? Because properly at this point, the papacy was telling some of the highest sovereigns of Christianity what to do, and they would obey, given that political situation. So it was modified what had been, for example, established in the Third Lateran Council of 1179, not only the licety of the priest to stain himself of blood by comminating, you know, in fact, bloody penalties had been, you know, reinforced. A norm that rendered, by the way, necessary of course, the recourse to the secular arm, as we were saying, of the Catholic princesses for the execution of the condemnations. But it was also another step relatively to the agreement that existed on the theme of anti-heretical repression that had existed between Pope Lucius III and Frederick Barbarossa in 1184, that had been concretized in the famous decretal ad abolendum, in which it was established that those lay authorities that would have not responded to the request of the priests to fight heresies would have been excommunicated, right? So this naturally put in the hands of also the local clergy, aside from the papacy, an enormous force that could be exploited politically from the papacy to say, look, you know, these people, generally speaking, you know, that there's always been this kind of love and hate between the two institutions, right? It's always been a big political compromise between lay and secular authorities to work together. You know, it would be advantageous from one side, from the other, naturally, that there were different interests, also different prerogatives. Well, this was starting to be one of them. And such positions that were inserted in the cautious policy with which the Church throughout all the 12th century had persecuted in the political jurisdictional supremacy on the papacy were now evolved under the heretical threat in an orientation of uncompromising hierarchy. So that properly the true heretics, all their children, all those that in an open way had, or you know, even in a simulated one, favored the heterodox, had to be isolated from the rest of society. They were criminalized. Like, heresy began to appear this time both a doctrinal religious crime and also a kind of a crime of public nature. It may seem strange, like you would think this would exist before. Well, it didn't, right? And this is also properly not something to be so surprised of, after all. And the interesting aspect is that naturally this opened to the possibility of switching the thing for which a political crime, for example, the Ghibelline opposition to the papal supremacy, could be punished in terms of heresy, so that not just those people who opposed heresy were, you know, condemned by the papacy, by excommunication, but also those who fought the papacy could be condemned of heresy as well. So the others were, all the other lay authorities were forced to fight against him. And this is dramatic, especially if you consider what was happening, and what would happen, especially in the 13th century. Right? Think about the reign of Frederick II and how these weapons were used, and how the thing went on. For some time, at least, when both the imperial and papal authority decreased dramatically, especially by the mid 14th century. So this push to perfection the ideas and the instruments of anti-heretical repression was born essentially as a response to Catharism, but as it's evident, it was now extended to every enemy of the Church of Rome, and this could not just be said, in fact, relatively to Rome's attitude towards the heresy and its repression, because exactly in these years, with the institution, for example, of the mendicant orders, and as we have seen in other videos, and we will keep seeing, were refined specifically the most effective weapons through which the Church would have fought and marginalized the threat of religious dissidents, right? Because the new orders that were coming from the same Pauperistic-Evangelical background now represented a model virtue, according to, of course, given that the papacy controlled their orthodoxy, but they would manage, and that was probably the greatest success of the Church in a real sense, not the Crusades, right? But probably this work of mediation with these other groups that would manage to counter successfully, right, the heretical proselytism with a minute pastoral initiative that was led prevalently through the ranks of that same urban lay classes that, as we have seen before, were the hub in many ways of the cradle, of the heresy itself. That would, that was at the same time, however, the soft underbelly of the same heterodox message, because it was more compromising after all. So the heresies, they had exploited, generally speaking, the movements of the poor classes. As we've seen, there was probably an elite that even in southern France had now to compromise with even with the failure after the Crusade and so on. But the heresies were so weakened and emarginated before they could be just wiped out by for example, the Inquisition. And through the campaign against heresy, the mendicant orders inflicted heavy defeats as papal agents. For example, to the Ghibelline party, to which heresy was in some way linked. Even in here, as we've seen before, it was not completely true, but surely, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, right? And we should talk about that on some other occasion, because still the society was Christian anyway, right? So it's especially for the elites, that, as we've seen, were the ones who, after all, had backed the papacy more willingly in many ways. But this offensive was naturally to grow, as we were saying before, especially after the death of Frederick II, right, when the presence of the empire in Italy entered in crisis, so that the papacy expanded dramatically its power, and by the mid 13th century, the Cathars were still there actually, but they were destined to extinction at this point, and they would maintain some, pale visibility, mixing with other heterodox movements, because as we've seen, the same movement was pretty unstable by itself, and as always in marginal peripheral areas where the echo of their threat would have vanished, or the old threat would have been extinguished. And this naturally doesn't mean that Catharism disappeared as a whole, right? There is plenty of of European traditions and folklore that are somewhat connected, if not to Catharism proper, but generally speaking to certain relics of this broader past of paganism and doctrinal ambiguity in Christian terms that lived into this I can't say generally superficially Christianized, but realities, but in which, of course, lots of other beliefs survived. As we were saying before, the church wasn't even interested actually in what the peasantry, for example, thought, because it was no threat, right? They didn't have the intellectual means to threaten it. Instead, the Cathars had it, so had them. So that was very important for the church, and I can say it justifies its reaction, but definitely motivates it. And if you take a closer look to what the whole thing was really about, it's not a clash between obscurantism and free thinking. It's not a clash between violent and non-violent. It's not a clash between not even the stronger, the richer and the poorer, because we have seen that this distinction, Cathar reality, doesn't even make sense. They had knights and were backed by the local nobility. And also, in my opinion, this is my subjective judgment, so you don't have to take it as an historical reality, but I presume that the thing was, if not doomed from the beginning, but it was just destined to remain peripheral in many ways for the same entity of its message, right? I don't think that that there could be the premises for this system to spread further from that condition of, in fact, of marginality to which, after all, this came to be relegated. As we have seen, the classes among which it spread more easily were also the ones that were more compromising and intelligent, because the middle classes are, generally speaking, the most gifted in that regard. Maybe not at this time, maybe still the elite that has the point, but these guys were starting to make a lot of money themselves, and they were entering in the game, even as within the one of the elite, in many ways. So, as I was saying throughout the whole video, that there would be so much to talk about in terms of these relations only that it's embarrassing. So that's why I go step by step. And we made other videos, for example, about the legalization of the of other groups, the repression of others. By the way, if he's still in the process of the ecclesiastical integration of the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements. And we'll have to see even the origins of this whole thing, because the origins are very interesting indeed. And in order to understand better even what the instances of these movements really were, right? And as I was saying before, also in the medieval Christianity playlist, we have already a lot of stuff talking about this, so this just is added to the pile. But for now, let's stop it here. And I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.